Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Drew, the host of Taboo Topic, with my host, Ryan from Between the Liars. Ryan.
How's it going, Ken?
Pretty good.
Got
You
that
enjoyed my
energy
segment?
night.
I do. It's election night, folks, and you may be wondering, why aren't we live? Why aren't we going right now on Friday? Well, because of the subject at hand, and today's episode is talking about election integrity, I figured let's go ahead and talk live right now as the results are coming out. So there's going to be two episodes tonight, one of which will be a blueprint edition, and the other one will be just a regular collaboration. So first part will actually just be talking about election integrity and our sentiments and proposals we could come up with. And then the second half will be a shorter segment, just maybe like 30 minutes to an hour, as far as just reacting live and giving you, the audience, a general view and a general sentiment as far as how Ryan and I feel the night's going to go. So did you go out and vote, Ryan?
No, I didn't. I'm in Kentucky and I'm registered in Tennessee, and I couldn't get away today, and I did not have the foresight to do absentee. So
well,
do as I say, not as I do. You should still go vote.
Well, to be fair, Tennessee, Kentucky is like strong likelihood it's going to go red.
Yeah, that's
Then again,
people like that is what leads to flip flops. So.
Well, that's true, but
Kentucky, yes, you are correct.
But Kentucky also does have a Democrat governor, don't they?
We do. Yep, Andy Beshear.
Yeah. So,
yep.
How is she, if you don't mind asking me?
Yep.
Sorry.
People have mixed reviews. A lot of people particularly disliked his COVID stances. He actually got sued by T.J. Roberts, who we've had on Between the Liars, and was successfully held to account because he was basically allowing liquor stores to stay open but shutting down churches, and so they sued him on the grounds of First Amendment violation. And that was what the judge held to be the case. So it was interesting. So I guess it really depends on who you ask. I will say, to Andy's credit, my understanding is that the budget in the state of Kentucky has kind of been a shit show, and he's had to make some tough calls for what's cut. And of course, the one who makes the cuts is the one who gets blamed for things. So in his defense, I will say that it sounds like he's had to raise taxes to account for government blowouts, even by the Republican governor before him. So I will be fair to both sides in that instance. But yeah, definitely depends on who you ask. Personally, yeah, Kentucky has a 5% state tax, just like a flat rate. Doesn't matter what you make, you get 5% scraped off. So
I see. Well, here in Florida,
Tennessee has none. What does Florida have? There is no income tax in Tennessee. Yeah, and that's the way I personally like it. But that's I hate half my paycheck goes to taxes and other stuff. That might be a slight exaggeration, but
I mean, you also have the federal tax that it gets taken out as well, I'm assuming. So
a little bit lower this year since I'm married, filing jointly, but not by enough, in my opinion.
Must be nice. Just kidding. Really quickly, folks, I wouldn't want to go ahead and give the credit to the introduction music to Devin Farley, my friend from Kentucky, actually. So I'm pretty sure if you're watching, Devin, please vote if you haven't done so already. Don't be a Ryan. Just kidding, Ryan. All love.
Hey, I deserve that. You're good. You're good.
Also, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Most of us don't do it, but please, for our self-esteem, hit the notification bell and boost it, and also boost our algorithm chances so more people can see what we do and see what we're talking about. Reach more audience members. So increase our audience. Help us out. Help me. Help you. Help me. Help you, from Jerry Maguire. So today's topic, last week real quickly, we started talking about the election process in general. We talked about the electoral process. We talked about having solutions and amending the electoral process. So if you're interested in hearing our thoughts about how we could fix the electoral process and strengthen it while still in alignment with shrinking the size of government, please go back to last week's episode on Taboo Topic and Between the Liars. I'm not sure. Are you still posting audio at least, or is right now all YouTube on your end?
It's mostly YouTube, but it's hit or miss. I don't think we've updated any audio in quite some time. So,
okay. Well, on my end, if you want to see the audio, come over on my end, and there will be the audio as well from last week. That'll come out 2 weeks from now, actually, because I missed 1 week. And so
Boo.
I know, shame on me. I am slacking myself. Life got a little bit busy for me too. So with that said, tonight, as I alluded to, is election integrity. That's today's topic. And folks, Ryan, myself, we all have a lot of skepticism towards the election process as far as the integrity, especially what happened after 2020. Now, talking to you, Ryan, I know you've kind of had like an evolution as far as your perspective, what happened during the election of 2020. When I first talked to you, you're more in alignment with the idea that there wasn't like major election fraud that took place. And now your perspective has changed. So go ahead, let me know, like just a quick breakdown of your perspective about the conversation of election integrity. Maybe even goes far to talk about like your transition from your perspective on the issue from the night of 2020 when it first happened to now.
Sure. So, I mean, yeah, you're always going to have a certain amount of fraud. The question is not, is there fraud? The question is, to what degree is there fraud? I'm still not convinced that there was enough fraud to where I'm like, oh, yes, Joe Biden was not the duly elected president. However, the people who come out and say this was the freest, fairest election and that there was no fraud are also erring on the other side. So I've taken more of a middle road perspective that, of course, there were instances of fraud. There's also a lot of really suspicious things that happened that night. Now, I also believe that if they had actual hard evidence as to what they would claim is significant fraud beyond the statistical significance that like this massively swayed the election, then my question is, why has that not been brought out in court, right? So because that hasn't been brought out, I'm highly skeptical of the degree to which the fraud actually impacted the election. But that's not to say that I don't think that there was wildly suspicious things that happened. And I don't think that, any people should be so trusting of their government that they're just like walking around with their eyes, mostly closed, like, oh, yep, nothing to see here. I think that if the government is doing what they're supposed to be doing and that they're actually having the election be upheld in its integrity, then it's okay to question. Now, you don't want to step out on the other side and be like, no election is ever secure. And this is what's been interesting to me, actually, as we've come up to election day. A lot of Joe Biden's claims have basically been, if the Republicans win, the election is not free. It's not fair. There's been intimidation tactics, Jim Crow. There's been, some kind of tampering. But then when they win, it's the freest and fairest. And it's that type of inconsistency that really bothers me. And right now it's the Democrats who are doing that. So I'm going to pick on them a little bit. But anytime anyone is basically creating what I would call a non-falsifiable premise, right? Because you can't falsify something or prove it is false if basically your standard is, as long as we win, it's good. When we don't win, it's not. Like that's not, you cannot then say that something is truly secure if it's hinging on whether or not someone that you prefer is elected. However, I will say that that's not to say that people who are like, hey, my side lost, but I still have some massive questions, that I'm automatically going to be dismissive of that. So that's kind of my current perspective on the issue. Nothing, well, at least I don't think too terribly exciting there, but let me know below what y'all think.
Well, it has shifted in the sense like you do believe there is more fraud that took place than you originally thought from watching the 2000 Mules documentary.
Oh, well, that and other things as well. I mean, you've had sources come out that are like, here's what happened. Yeah, of course. And as we didn't really see that. I think the last time we really talked about this was like right in the wake afterwards. And we've had 2 years at this point to have stuff come out. So yeah, absolutely. It's definitely shifted.
Yeah. So for my audience, if you've been following me for a while, you know where I stand on this issue. Like, call me Alex Jones and deplatform me for all I care. But I have a hard time believing that Joe Biden won fair and square, at least. I cannot say that Joe Biden won, but I definitely believe the results were compromised, and it was stupid for the state legislators at the time to certify the election results when there's clearly so many questions and a lot of skepticism as far as what happened that night, that I thought if I were in that situation, granted, Monday night quarterbacking, armchair quarterback, whatever you want to call it, hindsight's 2020. I would like to think anyway, if I was in that situation, I would not have voted yes to certify the election results, despite all the public pressure. Again, hindsight's 2020. I have not been in that situation, but like I said, I have a hard time, and I still have a hard time, even watching documentary 2000 Mules. I'm more convinced than ever now that there's a high likelihood, high possibility that Donald Trump could have won in that election. So I have more of a more exciting perspective of what happened on 2020 than Raya does.
So then let me ask you this and give you a chance to kind of push back against the pushback there. So the pushback then is you're a bitter clinger, you're disgruntled, the person you wanted to win didn't win. How do you respond to something like that if that's someone's accusation towards you?
If you look at what happened as far as like what has come out since then, I do not care if you're a Democrat or Republican, but when you have thousands of votes being affected and duplicated and manipulated, that should have, I don't care if it happened to, I don't care if it was Joe Biden. If it was the other way around, I would be just as upset, I would imagine anyway, because I want you, the voters, to feel as though your vote counts at least. And that's what this conversation is really about. And that's what we're trying to go over tonight is we have at least half the nation who feels as though at least their votes don't count anymore, or they feel really skeptical about whether or not their vote is going to be properly counted or legally counted. And so it's not really about disgruntled about the fact that my side didn't win. I'm disgruntled about the fact as far as I feel as though my legal vote, the illegal votes outweighed the legal votes. And so my legal cast, my legal ballot got drowned out all the other illegal votes. That's my pushback to your pushback.
No, that's the opportunity I wanted to give you. So where do we want to start with this, Ken?
So we're going to start with, we're going to start with talking about, because a lot of times when it comes to what happened in 2020, we have two different perspectives as far as the responses to how to address the 2020 situation. You have the Republican red states who are passing election integrity measures because they think that's the issue. And then you have the Democrats who are trying to address what they deem to be election integrity as well. But for them, it's more about expanding voter rights. And I think in order to understand why we think election integrity is not the Democrats' version, we have to understand what happened during the 2020 election, at least all the sketchy stuff that took place anyway, for the audience to understand as far as why we think these laws in the state level needed to be passed anyway, such as voter ID law, for example, which, according to the Democrats, it's the new Jim Crow now. Little things like that, I think would help the audience understand that these measures passed by states was not a result of disgruntled the fact that their side lost. It was a genuine response to a concern by the people. So one of the things that took place during the year of COVID, which many people, if you remember, Ryan, that altered everything, including the election process. And so what ended up happening a lot of the times was that state legislators, in some instances, last minute decided to go ahead and make changes, such as Pennsylvania, where they allowed mail-in ballots to take place without any sort of vetting system in particular. Now,
And that,
go ahead.
I was going to say, and that last minute change, if you don't, I'm not necessarily opposed to change. I'm opposed to change for the sake of change. If you allow your change to become sloppy and they didn't have the infrastructure, let's say in that instance, to maintain the high security that they should have had, then that's where I'm like, okay, that's kind of a little bit sketchy, right? Because if you were like, hey, we're going to change this, and if they hadn't changed it midstream, because actually, I guess it partially depends on where you're at, but you're not supposed to be able to change anything in the midst of an election cycle. You're supposed to wait, right? It's kind of like the fiscal year budgets. You're always passing for the year ahead. You're not just tweaking as you go, because that's where then you start getting the accusations that things are unfair. And that's where I think they wind up opening themselves up to a lot of accusations of election, at least the potential for election fraud. Even if I can't come in and say that there was a lot out there, you've still got the accusation that is valid, that it wasn't put in place with enough safeguards that we can say that it was as secure as it should have been.
And I'm going to go ahead and read off the report by the Republican National Committee from about the 2020 election. And you guys can look this up yourselves. You can go to my Substack, by the way, kenja296.substack.com, and look for the article that talks about election integrity, literally smaller government, election integrity. And there's like a link as far as to the Republican National Committee, as far as their report of what happened on the election on the night of 2020. And I don't care if you believe like massive voter fraud took place or you thought little voter fraud took place. The fact that they found these irregularities, these flaws, again, should disturb any sane human being, I would imagine anyway. So first point in the report states Democrats, including some public officials, used the pandemic as a pretense to achieve long-sought policy goals such as expanded mail-in voting and the elimination of key safeguards, specifically for absentee voting, such as witness and ID requirements. One of those examples is the automatic mailing of ballots to voters who did not request them, including states such as New Jersey and Nevada that had no tradition of heavy absentee voting, and were unprepared to scale up their process. And I can attest to this. I had a friend who got like 5 mail-in ballots from Arizona, and guess what, Ryan? They weren't registered voters. And they still got mail-in ballots mailed to them.
Well, and here's the argument to that, is they will say, well, if you're not legally able to vote, then your vote won't count. And it's like, well, technically that's the case, but that's banking on a perfect system that catches that error, right? Because if you are sent the ballot and you turn in the ballot, of course they check the ballots. That's what they're supposed to do. But if the ballot can be sent out, then of course the ballot can slip through. So the more, like statistically, the more you have of something, the greater your chances of something falling through. Doesn't mean it's automatically guaranteed to have higher fraud, but it does mean that statistically speaking, you would want to account for that. Actually, when you're running a statistical test and you're comparing multiple things, just fun fact for my social science people, the reason you run a more complex test that accounts for multiple things is that you avoid the potential for error. So for example, if I'm comparing this to this, this to this, and this to this, and this to this, I would run a test that tests all of them against each other at once instead of individually doing them, because when I do it 4 times, I have a greater likelihood of error. The same is true for when we have something like ballots going out like this. You have more out there. Let's say there's 1,000 ballots that aren't supposed to go out versus 1 million. Well, the likelihood of a goalie stopping 1,000 shots versus 1 million, could it happen? Yes. But like, it's kind of like the goalie. And then the other thing is you throw the goalkeepers, in this case, into chaos. You tell me what happens.
Yes. A lot of flaws and irregularities will probably end up happening. Now, another example was how state courts ignored laws enacted by their legislators, such as ballot delivery deadlines. So if you remember, Ryan, I don't know if you remember this story coming out of Michigan, but there were stories coming out of Michigan of people just dropping in with like big boxes of ballots, like long after the deadline was already passed. And I think it was like 8 o'clock. That was like their deadline. And that was like a state law. But somehow they found, air quote, all these ballots at midnight. And they needed to be counted, Ryan. They needed to be counted because every vote matters at that point. So that's just one little example as far as how courts ignored state laws that are already passed by their legislators. Now, some other findings includes the Democrats or Democrat-controlled states. They lowered the reviewing standards for counting ballots and insufficient ballot duplication procedures. This easing of standards combined with a lack of observer access, the processing and counting of absentee ballots could have not coincided at a worse time. If you remember, again, I think it was like Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular, if I remember correctly, where it was Michigan. It was in Michigan, I think, where they kicked out a lot of the Republican poll watchers, and instead of letting them back in, They put barricades so they couldn't see what was going on.
Right.
Now, tell me that's not sketchy. I don't care.
Well, it's very sketchy, and I was just double checking this because I wanted to be sure that I had the information correct. But you also had Benford's law, the idea that there's kind of like this almost bell curve tail, right?
Right.
And what we saw for Joe Biden was it was as the night goes on, it's draping off. Then there was a big spike at the end, and there were some
out of
people
nowhere
saying, and some people were saying, well, this automatically indicates fraud, which is false. However, the people who are saying, well, that's just normal, that's also false, right? Like it's kind of a test to see, is this a red flag? Is kind of how it's supposed to be used. So again, suspicious. Does it automatically mean that, you know, that the election integrity is compromised? No, but it's very weird when you have at the end of the night, you know, just a bunch of boxes being dropped off. Actually, I would say that I can say with pretty much absolute certainty that the boxes being dropped off is definitely a red flag for the sake that it is indicating, at least generally speaking, a bunch of ballot harvesting, which personally I disagree with. And we've had whole episodes devoted to this, right? But when you have people just dropping off ballots, they've harvested them. And the more that you have other people picking up your ballots, there's the whole issue of in districts where it's like, okay, I'm going to send, you know, a bunch of people who tend to vote more Republican or represent, but they're supposed to be, you know, independent. But then they collect these ballots like, oh no, they got lost, right? And so it's like, well, that's the problem that can arise, and the issue that I have with ballot harvesting. And when you just have a bunch of them dropped off, you didn't have a lot of last minute voters. You had a bunch of stuff just dropped off, which is ballot harvesting. So I actually had a greater issue with the ballot harvesting than I did the fact that the ballots were dropped off all at once. I also have an issue, like you were talking about there a second ago, with the fact that they wind up just every vote needs to be counted. It's like, well, yes, but if you miss your deadline, you miss the deadline, right? If I turn in, I can't say never, but just think about this when you're turning a paper into your professor. Of course, there are some exceptions, but when there's a deadline, there's a deadline. You can't just say, well, you know, I was a minute late. It's like, well, a minute late is a minute late. Like that's kind of the way that it is. It's why when you're standing in an election line, if you are in line before the cutoff, you can't be turned away. You can vote after time, but you can't show up after and then be like, oh, I was delayed. Right. So.
And so with that said, another one I want to go over real quick as far as what they found is the chief among these ongoing failures of states to clean up their voter rolls, talking about voter rolls, and this is where the idea of like dead people voted, right? Add security vulnerabilities in election voting systems and infrastructure. There continues to be an ongoing problems with the lack of public access to important election records and data. So again, you would have stories coming out of Pennsylvania where Jane, who passed away in 2012, maybe somehow voted in the general election in Pennsylvania, or someone who was 200 years old, they were able to vote still, you know? And that's the result of states not keeping up with their voter data rolls at that point.
Right. And here's the argument that I mean, Chris from the Alt Left podcast, he's made this argument when we debated this before, that, well, that's not enough to sway an election, or, you know, that's kind of a glitch. And it's like, well, but I think that indicates that there are glitches that can get through. Like, I don't think that there was enough dead people who voted for it to sway the election. But I still think that it does highlight the need for us to have greater election security, because like our topic for tonight, if you don't have enough security, then there will not be faith in the election. Because if you think that there's at least a potential for fraud, then those same people are highly unlikely at best
to go out and vote again.
Well, not just to go out and that the election is duly elected, right? Like part of the problem is the argument against people who say that Joe Biden didn't win is, well, you had a fraud there that's at least raising suspicion. We can top our election. Of course, you can dismiss those. You still dismiss, you know, in my opinion, this is where you and I deviate, right? The idea that Joe Biden was not duly elected. I say that he was, but it raises a very important point that the election security had so many red flags, like you had just mentioned before, that it becomes problematic. And at the bottom line, perception at the end of the day is reality. What people think is the case it doesn't mean that that's what truth is, but it means that that's what they believe the truth is, right?
Right.
It's why in social science, at least in my field, we actually focus a lot more on the perceptions that people have of situations that unfold instead of the objective truth of those situations. Because at the end of the day, I react to what I believe, not necessarily what is quote unquote objective truth.
Right. Now, as a result of that, I'm going to spat out some allegations as far as what I believe to be actually happened. The Clinton-funded fact checkers would disagree with me, but just going.
Wait, Politico's funded? What?
What? No, never.
No, what?
No, I didn't know that either. No. So again, whether or not you believe whether or not you believe the results were compromised enough to where Trump should have won or could have won instead of Biden, or whether you're more with Ryan's position where you thought Biden was a legitimate winner, these numbers should really disturb anyone. I mean, if the report's enough, didn't make you feel disturbed, because I guess it's one thing to say, okay, we hear that's what happened, everything like that, but what are the results from those failures and everything like that? And so these are the numbers that, stood out to me. And I've written a few articles on this in the past, but let's go to Nevada, where Joe Biden won. Nevada had 1,500 votes counted despite those individuals being recorded as dead. 1,500 individuals dead, but they were counted anyway. Arizona's election audit confirmed 17,000 duplicate votes. 17,000. Remember, this margin of error that Biden won under was very small. It wasn't by a lot. So 17,000 could easily swing the vote. Georgia also had major issues with duplicate votes, but Michigan roughly had 66,000 unregistered ballots counted. And let's go to Texas, because right now you're thinking, okay, these are just swing states. Texas, a state Trump won, had 11,000 votes counted from unregistered citizens. That's Texas. Now, if that doesn't disturb the average person, then I don't know what to tell you, to be honest. I really don't know what to tell you. Now, like I said, the Clinton-funded fact checkers like Politico will come at me and probably talk to the CEOs of YouTube like, hey, take this guy down, deplatform him. He's spewing misinformation, whatever. He's spewing lies. But these is what I consider to be real. And to me, it's like these numbers are so out of whack and so almost precise that's like you would have to be a liar, a genuine liar, or you're just nuts, or you're telling the truth. And I think they're telling the truth. In the criminal justice system, there's a saying that, if I remember correctly, that goes, conspiracy is a prosecutor's best friend. Because if it smells sketchy and if it smells rotten, chances are something's rotten going on. And there's truth to the conspiracy of what's happening. Now, notice I didn't go over like the Dominion voter system and everything like that. I'm not trying to get sued or anything like that. But if you want to look into that, there's also some sketchy stuff that concern those machines. Now, with that said, the Democrats, in response, their ideas, from my perspective, and one of them, and I'll go over them in just a second, but in my opinion, would exacerbate the problems and the irregularities that we found in the election of 2020, in my opinion. And I'll read, because the Democrats earlier in Biden's presidency, they were trying to expand voter rights, quote unquote, because they felt as though the Republicans, the state they were passing, felt was a quote unquote Jim Crow. The new Jim Crow, as Joe Biden called it. They deemed it racist. Now, if you're not aware of some of their ideas, let me know if you think whether or not this would exacerbate the problems that we saw in the 2020 election cycle. First part of the proposal, prohibit states from requiring an excuse to vote absentee. Require states to mail in absentee ballots to all voters. It doesn't say like registered voters or anything like that, just all voters. Very vague, right? Prohibit states from requiring absentee ballots to be notarized or have witness signatures. Count all absentee ballots postmarked by election day within 10 days. Requires states to offer 15 consecutive days of early voting. require, to the greatest extent practical, that polling places keep the waits under 30 minutes, require states that mandate voter IDs to also accept sworn statements by the voter. So in other words, if I have a ballot with totally different name, I can have someone lie for me and say, yeah, he is who he says he is. He doesn't need to show an ID to prove who he is, who I say I am. So, in my opinion, tightly restricts states' ability to purge voters from the rolls as well. These are just some of the provisions that the Democrats tried to propose that I thought would exacerbate the problems we saw in the 2020 election.
Here's something that I'm picking up on as you're going over those that I think makes it logically inconsistent. So you can't claim that everyone needs to vote and that voting places have to keep the wait below 30 minutes. Just logically thinking about this, if you have more people voting, there will be longer lines, especially if you don't have more funding to open more polling places.
Right.
And if you need to open more polling places to maintain the election integrity and the security, you have to have more people who are either staff or volunteers. So you need to increase all of these things. And while I think it's great that we strive for these places to, have low wait times and more accessibility and all of that, accessibility as in places that you can go and vote, the ability to vote absentee, the ability to, work with your schedule, because some people legitimately can't get off work. However, I think that there's kind of an offset to that you don't need to have no voter ID, right? Like I think that a form of identification, if I need one to do literally anything, then there's no reason that can't be required, especially because the states that are requiring voter ID, like Georgia, for example,
yeah, they
are providing one free of charge if you don't have a license. So I think that when you make a reasonable accommodation like that, that really cuts it down. But I just think it's very interesting that you have someone who is claiming that we need everyone to go and vote. Every vote needs to count.
Right.
But they won't raise staffing and the security that would be necessary to do so. And they also want the waits to be below 30 minutes. I don't think you can have it both ways, at least not in the status quo. You need to change something.
Mm-hmm. So now, another thing that happened during this process is that the Democrats were trying to pass this just by using filibuster or eliminating the filibuster.
Yeah.
So simple majority. So basically, they were going to try to ignore the whole constitutional process because essentially this strips a lot of the state rights they had. Now, with that said, that's not to say, and this is where this show's about to be, the edition is about to be an oxymoron, because I know it's about shrinking the size of government. But this is the only part I would say the federal government needs to step in and grow in power, in the sense of ensuring states do not take and abuse the trust of the people in the states.
Really? You and I have very different approaches to this then. So you think that the elections should be federalized then?
Not entirely. And you'll see what I mean by it in just a second.
Okay.
I still believe state rights. You read my Substack. This is not a surprise to you, right?
I'm just messing. It's for dramatic effect.
But even if you don't agree whether or not the federal government should get more involved in some of these aspects anyway, at least you can agree whether or not this should take place at a state level. And this should give you some ideas, the audience, an idea of what you should want at your state level, at least. And like I said, for me, I'm okay with allowing the federal government to step in for these reasons. And I'm going to explain these proposals. But I also want to clarify, I do not believe in just a simple majority. I still believe you have to go through the constitutional amendment process first in order to amend, because these ideas would require would be stripping away a lot of these state rights as far as their ability to their electoral process. I can't talk English all of a sudden. But with that said, let me go ahead and go over some of my proposals. And again, if Ryan and I end up having an impasse on this, at least you could walk away thinking, okay, I at least want this at a state level. So, first part, to my federalize of the federal government stepping in, or at least like increase the size of government in the sense of every state shall practice use it or lose it procedures for federal elections to ensure the voter registration presents an accurate reflection of the state population. States have a discretion on the application of this requirement. Point number 2, every state shall impose a proper vetting system of identification with a minimum requirement of a photo identification card. Point number 3, every state shall practice in-person voting, making limited exceptions for mail-in ballots to include citizens who are handicapped, military personnel, and first responders. Point number 4, every state shall prohibit from practicing election day voter registration. Next point, every state is prohibited from accepting new ballots after the national election day. Next point, American citizens must take the initiative to register to vote. Next point, only American citizens are eligible to register to vote. And last point, all subjects not covered in this amendment are subject to Article 10. Like I said, reasonable expansion of the federal government's role in the election process, and it's to minimize the corruption, but only through the constitutional amendment process. State legislators can decide on every other manner, such as early voting, vetting systems, voting machines, online registration. Heck, if they want to have like an election day in their state, make that declare a holiday, that's their right, if it's within the people's interest. But none of those subjects increase the chance for voter manipulation or election manipulation and canceling out the legal vote to gain a political advantage in the final count. California is arguably the most corrupt state in its election process. And unless the federal government intervenes, the state is a lost cause. But that can't happen, Ryan. That can't happen under the current limitations placed in the Constitution since the beginning of the nation's foundation anyway. Voter rights were at the forefront for reform, and now I think it's time to have the conversation. If we want to avoid a third world status anyway, election integrity should be the main concentration of the 21st century.
Okay, so I'll start by saying that I agree with you that there are times the federal government needs to step in. This is why there is the 10th Amendment, right? The Supremacy Clause, whatever powers are not delegated to the federal government go to the states. And I do like your approach. This would be constitutionally amended, basically making another enumerated power, right? They would basically be dictating, at least for federal elections, because my understanding from the way you phrased all of that, it doesn't affect state elections. California
Correct.
wants to run it however they want to. New York can
Correct.
have non-citizens voting and stuff like that, but not in the federal election.
Correct.
And not in any and that would include like state and Senate races for the U.S. portions, right? U.S. House, U.S. Senate.
This is all just for general election.
I don't think that is bad to have a standard, and I do like that you set this up as a amendment so that kind of just specifies the new enumerated powers. My question is, how does that function on a practical level, right? Because I don't think we have the states right now. Like, do we just fiat this and just say it would happen? Or like, how would you hope to get this as a, like, let's say you and I try to do this today, right? Like a lot of this we've talked about, like revamping a lot of it and trying stuff, but like how would you get around the fact that I don't think enough states would give this power to the federal government? Or is this just kind of our wish list of wishful thinking? Because that's fine too. I'm just curious.
This is just like we've talked about, like the first episode of Blueprint. This is just our ideal. Okay. Cool. This is not
well. And I ask because some of these things are like legitimate. Like some of these issues, I think it's a close enough race that we could actually try to call a convention of states, right? Like for some of these issues, right. I don't know that this one would. Although it would be interesting to see the coalition between Democrats and Republicans because they seem to tout the same things, but at different times for different reasons. Right. Because like the Democrats want all of this redone at the federal level. And I think that the Republicans right now don't, mostly because they don't hold the power. My question is if we, see a flip in the Senate and the House, would Republicans start being in favor of something like this? Because I know right now they sure as hell aren't. But I'm wondering if it's because they don't hold the power or because they have, quote unquote, principles. You know what I mean? Like I'm curious.
And I would say, even if the Republicans did gain control of power, if they are trying to bypass the constitutional amendment process,
right,
you're going to hear me have a gripe with them at that point.
Oh, of course. I'm just saying that, like right now, because like in theory, you could get a coalition between the two to set a national standard. but they both want national standards for different things, and they want different national standards,
Right.
which means that they won't form a coalition. But it would be interesting to see if you could leverage that.
Right. Now, with that said, I'm sure there's even like to answer your question, right? Let's say this is like we're trying to get like enough states to ratify this, right?
Right.
I'm sure the majority of states would probably agree that only American citizens should be eligible to register to vote.
No, a majority, yes, but you're seeing it become more popular in New York and California and maybe a few other states that non-citizens need representation in their local governments and their state governments.
Right. And we don't necessarily, we can live without California, New York, if we have the 3/4 of the states that are in favor of amending the Constitution anyway.
Yeah.
And if they want to make this a requirement, I think a lot of the states, the majority of states, would be in favor of that. American citizens must take the initiative to register to vote. So so Governor Newsom just can't send me a ballot for no reason.
He wouldn't send that to you. You're not one of his constituents.
No, he probably hates me if he saw me right now. But to avoid a scenario like my friend who was from Arizona that got 5 mail-in ballots and he wasn't even a registered voter to begin with. So he would actually have to take the time to initiate it himself and register to vote. I think a lot of the people in the majority of these states would probably agree with that. Probably the identification card, voter ID, which has like, at least when it comes to popularity across the board, I would say that would probably have a general consensus, and majority of states get on board with that as well.
I just got a notification from Tim Pool's podcast, voting machines are failing in Arizona. So I got distracted by that. I'm sorry.
And folks, we'll be taking a 30-minute break after this episode. We're going to actually live react.
There's my first live reaction.
Yep. Oof. Anyways.
Do you want me to close this out with our normal closeout and then we come back fresh?
Well, first I want your actual pushback on my proposals, if you have any. I'm sure you haven't.
I did, but I didn't. Like I said, you checked most of the boxes of the issues that I would have with it. I think that
if you and I were to try to ratify this in the ratification process, what parts would you want to leave out? What parts would you keep, you would think?
It's an interesting paradox being more libertarian because you want to leave things the way that they are, but when they are left alone, not everyone holds that when they maintain power. So for that instance, or for that reasoning, I am every day leaning more and more towards specific targeted federal intervention from a constitutional perspective where like you check the boxes, but you enshrine that freedom. So honestly, I don't really have a lot of pushback on that. I mean, the big ones that you stuck out to me where I was going, well, that's a no duh, right? Is that like you set a reasonable time frame for votes to be counted. And the big one for me on that is that there's no reason for us to be waiting for a week and then waiting for it to be litigated and everything else before we know an election result. Like that's problematic on other levels, aside from like a security and integrity perspective. Like that's just, there's no reason that there can't be a quick due process there. But
wow.
Yeah, I know.
I'm surprised.
Okay, well, I'm going to be honest with you. I think the main reason you got around it is because you followed my boxes, which are the constitutional amendment perspective, instead of just ramming it through. And because of that, I like if that could be the case, I'd actually be in favor of it. I will state explicitly, I would not be in favor even if we had a filibuster-proof majority.
Right.
Let's say we got, I can't imagine this happening, but if we got a filibuster-proof majority in the House and the Senate from Republicans trying to pass something like this, I still wouldn't be in favor of that. It would have to go down the constitutional amendment route. So that's why there's not a lot of pushback. I know that makes it a little bit more boring and definitely quicker, but that's why, truthfully.
Wow. Well, I guess that's good to leave on that note then. Folks.
Know your audience. You figured me out.
Well, folks, make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell if you haven't done so already. Make sure you follow our social medias if you haven't done so already as well. You can follow me at Kenji_Express. You can follow Ryan's show, Between the Lines, just by typing in Between the Lines on any platform, really, including Twitter, which Twitter is about to be fair game, it looks like, I would say, thanks to Elon Musk. So it looks like free speech has a chance again. So we shall see with that. Anyways, Ryan, take it away, sir.
All right. Remember, you can find us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Twitch, and Google Podcasts. Follow our social media, stay updated like Ken mentioned, and be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channels. I'd like to get to 100 subscribers by the end of the year for Between Liars. That'd be great. If you enjoy this show, go ahead and give us a 5-star review and share us with your friends. We would certainly appreciate the time that you take to tell us why you love what we do. And you can help us envision a smaller, better, more accountable government by continuing to subscribe. And that starts with the blueprint. Catch you back here later. Bye for now.